Of course, the entire planning process depends on gathering the correct requirements from the client in the first place. Now you know why the next process, collect requirements, is important. When you are studying for the PMP, remember there will be many questions in the exam about this process, especially about the tools and techniques, so make sure you understand it well. This process begins to put the outputs of the planned scope management process into action. Collect requirements is the process of determining, documenting, and managing stakeholders' needs and requirements. Even when you try to fully define requirements at the beginning of the project, you will find that sometimes stakeholders are not clear about what they want or need. In these situations, as a project manager, you need to focus on collaborating with the stakeholders to discover their requirements, rather than just working to define the requirements. Because, as you already know, the success of a project is directly influenced by the stakeholders. Making sure that stakeholders are actively involved in this process can help deliver a successful project, which is aligned to the objectives and business needs. In some complex projects, or in projects which use new technology, you might find stakeholders don't really know what they need, or you might find that what they think they need is not what they actually need. So, when we are collecting requirements, we are not simply gathering them. It's not only about obtaining the requirements from end users, it's about working with them to understand what's really needed. Sometimes stakeholders may not have actual requirements, but they do often have wants or needs, although they may not be able to express them clearly. They may know there is a problem, but may not know exactly what it is. This is why we have to elicit the requirements from the stakeholders. Remember, elicit means more than just gathering or collecting. We also analyze the requirements to make sure they are aligned with the project objectives and business needs. We need to record and document them in enough detail because they will be used as inputs for other processes, and we use them to measure the project progress. Let's start with the inputs for the collect requirements process. Of course, we need to use the project charter as an input. The project charter is the starting point to add detail to the project work because it contains a high-level overview of the whole project. As we said before, the project charter is an output for the developed project charter process, which is part of the initiating process group. In all processes, we always need to use the project management plan, which is part of the integration knowledge area. This contains all the planning processes, but for the collect requirements process, we need three plans. From the previous process, plan scope management, we use the scope management plan, which contains information on how the project scope will be defined and developed. And we need the requirements management plan, which identifies how project requirements will be collected, analyzed, and documented. We also need the stakeholder engagement plan from the planned stakeholder engagement process. The stakeholder engagement plan tells us with whom and how we will communicate regarding the requirements. For example, in some project phases, you will collect requirements from senior management, while in another phase, you might start collecting requirements from the department managers. In a third phase, you might contact one branch, and so on. So you need guidance so you know with whom and when you need to communicate to obtain and discuss the requirements. However, we will talk about this in more detail during the stakeholder management knowledge area. We also need to use the project documents. As you know, each project has its own document related to the project performance, lessons learned, issues, financial documents, and so on. These documents are used in the project you're working on. At this stage, we call them project documents. You archive them throughout the project lifecycle, and you might use them for future phases or future projects. At this point, they become part of the organizational process assets or OBAs. The project documents we might need for collecting the requirements include first the assumption log, which is an output from the develop project charter process. We use the assumption log to record all the assumptions and constraints during the project lifecycle. The assumptions are things we assume will be true in the future, but which in reality may not come true. For instance, some assumptions might be the customer will assign a dedicated team, and the customer's team will support the project implementation and provide realistic information, or the customer will provide access permission to the vendor, and so on. These are all assumptions. As for constraints, there are factors which limit the team from executing the work, such as limitations of budget, time, or resources. For instance, the vendor must complete a specific number of deliverables within a specific deadline using a specific number of resources. They have to finish the project within 1 year, and they have 10 people, and the project budget is $200,000. These are examples of constraints which you have to be aware of at the beginning of the project. We need to use the assumption log as an input to collect the requirements so we can identify assumptions about the product, project, environment, stakeholders, and other factors that can influence requirements. I hope you remember that the initial version of the assumptions is kept in the benefits management plan, which is part of the business documents. When we are collecting requirements, we might want to review lessons learned. So, from the Manage Project Knowledge process, we need to use the Lessons Learned register. I explained the lessons learned when we talked about the organizational process assets, but here we use it to provide information on effective requirements collection techniques, especially for projects that are using an iterative or adaptive development approach. The next project document we need tells us who our stakeholders are and who can provide information on the requirements. So, from the initiating process group, we can find this information in the stakeholder register from the Identify Stakeholders process. When we identify stakeholders and record them in the stakeholder register, we also record their requirements and expectations for the project. Although we record the requirements, we might not do so in detail, so we use the stakeholder register as a basis when we are collecting the requirements. Then, we have business documents. I would like to remind you about Chapter 1, where I explained that the business documents are not project documents or project components. The business case is one of the business documents, and it's an input to the project as a whole. The business case includes market opportunities, opportunities for technological advancement, and potential areas for profit. It can also include what the organization needs to achieve the strategic objectives, etc. We need the business case to help us to collect the requirements because it describes what we need for meeting the business needs. Some of the criteria will be optional, some will be desired or wanted, and some will be required or mandatory. We also use the agreements, which are the contracts between the buyer and seller. We use this as an input to collect requirements because it might contain requirements related to the major deliverables or to the schedule or milestones, requirements related to the quality and the acceptance criteria or the warranty and insurance. All of these can guide you regarding what requirements you need. The last inputs we might use are the enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. We consider these when we are collecting the requirements. Now, let's look at the tools and techniques you might use. Again, don't forget this topic is important for the exam, so make sure you understand it well and focus on the keywords. A good way to think about the tools and techniques is that they are all basically focused on ensuring that your stakeholders tell you about the problem which the project is meant to solve. There are different ways you can do this. Sometimes you will sit down with each of them one to one, and other times you can meet with them as a group. One of the most important things to understand about requirements is that each requirement fulfills a specific stakeholder need. Also, all the tools and techniques of the collect requirements process can be used to gather project lessons learned. The first tool and technique we will use is expert judgment. Like we said before, you need it in all the processes. You need expert judgment from individuals or groups with a specialized knowledge or training in the subject matter. We also use data gathering techniques to collect data and information from various sources. In this process, we have 5 techniques we can use in data gathering. First, brainstorming. Brainstorming is when a group of people get together to generate multiple ideas and options related to the topic they discuss. For example, during the brainstorming session, one person mentions an idea to solve a problem, or in this case, determine scope. That idea generates an idea from another participant, which leads to another idea, and so on. Usually, there is a facilitator to manage this process, which has 2 parts: idea generation, where you create the ideas, and analysis, where you assess the ideas. This is a useful tool for gathering data and solutions or ideas from stakeholders in a short period of time. Brainstorming focuses on generating a quantity with the assumption that having a good quantity of ideas will lead to having a good quality outcome. Remember, in a brainstorming session, there is no criticism. All ideas are equal, and all are welcome, including ideas that are unusual. Of course, during the collect requirements process, the ideas should be related to the project requirements. The next technique we have is interviews. Interviews are a formal or informal method to get information from stakeholders by talking to them directly. Interviews can be performed by individual or multiple interviewers and can have individual or multiple interviewees asking prepared questions or questions that occur to them during the interview. This technique is useful because by talking to people one-to-one, you can get them to explain exactly what they need, so you can be sure you can achieve the project objectives. Interviews are also useful for obtaining confidential information. Another data gathering technique is focus groups. We use this technique when we are collecting the requirements. We also use it when we develop the project charter and whenever we're developing any plan for the project. If you have a look at the mapping diagram, you will see it used in 3 processes. Here in collect requirements, also in develop project charter, and the project management plan. Now, let's talk about the technique itself. We use focus groups as a way to get information, like needs and expectations, from a small group of people, such as stakeholders and subject matter experts with similar backgrounds. Remember that focus groups are not like normal meetings. You choose the participants in each group carefully based on their specialty. For instance, if you want to discuss or to collect requirements about application coding, then you will invite programmers to participate. In a group, the participants are likely to give you requirements that they wouldn't think of by themselves. Before you hold the focus group, you'll identify the goals of the discussion and you'll create questions about the topics to be discussed. This will help you to learn about their expectations and attitudes. You'll use a moderator to guide the discussion, focusing on areas you want to know about. Focus groups are more conversational than interviews, so it's important to create an environment where the participants are willing to talk. Another method we use is questionnaires and surveys. When you have a large number of stakeholders, you can use these to elicit requirements from them. For instance, you can prepare a questionnaire asking the stakeholders about a particular feature of the product. Questionnaires and surveys are most appropriate or useful in particular situations. For instance, with varied audiences, when a quick turnaround is needed. In other words, when you want the results quickly. These are also useful when the people completing the survey are not located in the same place. For instance, in global projects, the benefit of questionnaires or surveys is that you can do statistical analysis on the results. For instance, you can discover that a certain feature is preferred by 60% of your respondents, while another feature is requested by only 15%. The last data gathering technique we have is benchmarking. Benchmarking helps us to identify best practices. It's about gathering data from the best organizations in the same field, the best in industry, or the best practices, processes, or products in the organization. Benchmarking also helps us to generate ideas for improvement. We use the information we gather as a target against which we can improve project or product processes, and we use it to provide a basis for measuring performance. Another way we can identify requirements is to look at what other companies or other departments are doing. In this scenario, we are comparing internally or externally the actual practice and performance to what we have planned. By the way, this doesn't mean that we are only looking at different organizations or departments. If we have already completed a similar project in the past, then we can use it in benchmarking. We can use other sources as well, such as magazines, journals, social media, and so on. These are all considered as part of benchmarking. Let's have a look at data analysis in a bit more detail. When I explained data analysis earlier, I mentioned that we'll use it as a technique for many processes. In the previous process, plan scope management, we used data analysis, but the technique we used was alternatives analysis, in which we look at other options. The other type of data analysis we use here is document analysis. When collecting requirements, we also need to analyze the documents. That means we go through all the existing documents for our project and review and assess them to identify information relevant to the requirements. There are many documents you can analyze to collect requirements. As you can see here, agreements, business plans, business process, or any document you can get requirements from. You can see some examples listed here. Decision making is another one of the tools and techniques we will be using. In fact, it's used in many processes for each knowledge area. For instance, define a scope, estimate activity durations, estimate costs, and many other processes. Throughout the project life cycle, you're going to need to make many decisions. Any action you take during the project will require a decision to be made. There are many methods used for decision making, but within collect requirements, we use three. They are voting, autocritic decision making, and multicriteria decision analysis. Now let's look at each of these in a bit more detail. We will start with voting. You might face questions about this in the exam, so make sure that you are familiar with the keywords. We use voting to generate requirements. You might conduct voting to classify and prioritize the requirements. For instance, during the meeting between you and your team, you are discussing the product requirements. You discuss whether the software project requires you to use a specific tool or a specific feature. You can use voting to generate new requirements or classify the requirements so you can decide whether they are business requirements, functional requirements, or non-functional requirements. For instance, you also vote to prioritize them. For instance, some requirements will be more important to have now than others. Here are three examples of voting techniques. We choose them based on the situation. The first is known as unanimity. This is when all members of the group agree on one course of action, so no one disagrees with the decision. The second voting technique is majority. Here, the decision is agreed on by more than half of the group members. For instance, you have 10 participants. So, if 6 of them voted to make a decision, that's what we'll go with. We use this when we have two options to choose from. But to avoid the situation where 50% of participants say yes and 50% say no, it's better to involve an odd number of people. For instance, 11 or 9 participants instead of 10, so you make sure that you have a majority. The third technique is plurality. This is used when you have 3 or more options to choose from. You will find that the group will be split into 3 when they vote. You will go with the option that most people voted for, even if less than half of the group voted for it. For instance, you want to train the customers team, and you need them to choose where they want the training. So, they vote with 6 people choosing a hotel, 3 people choosing online, and 5 choosing in their office. In this case, you will hold the training in the hotel. The second decision-making technique we have is autocratic decision-making. In this method, one individual takes responsibility for making the decision for the group. That means the project manager or the person in charge makes the decision alone without asking for the opinions or suggestions of others. So, for instance, they can say, these are the requirements we need regardless what others need. As you can tell, this is not always the best option to use because it doesn't promote collaboration, but in some situations you might need to use it. If you can, it's best to avoid using it when you are making critical decisions. The third decision-making technique is multicriteria decision analysis. In this technique, we use a decision matrix which provides a system that we can use to analyze multiple requirements options. It allows us to work out which criteria we will use to evaluate the options and rank many ideas. To do this, we use risk levels, uncertainty, and valuation. So we want to estimate how much time each option needs, how much each option will cost, and also what benefits we'll get from each option. One of the formats we can use is a prioritization matrix, which is when we establish weighting criteria for the various options and rank them based on the scores we gave for each option. Common criteria or factors we use to measure the options are their availability, their cost, or their complexity. But you can add criteria which help you to make the decision. For instance, their ability or quality, or anything else based on the project. As you can see here in this example, we have various options. For instance, you might want to use a specific tool, or you want to buy phones, or use any equipment or materials, or even use resources from a specific area. So, you list all the options you have and compare them based on their availability, their cost, their complexity, and so on. Then you start by giving each option and the criteria a score, so you create a weighting system. Now, based on the total, you select the option with the highest score. Then you will make your decision based on these results. By the way, we can also use this matrix when we are hiring staff to evaluate the candidates based on their cost, their skills or knowledge, or their availability. However, we'll talk about this again during resource management. Now, let's look at another way of collecting requirements, that is, data representation techniques. This is where you use graphic representations to collect new requirements or to enhance the requirements we already collected based on the data and the information we have. We can use two methods to do this: affinity diagrams and mind mapping. Affinity diagrams are a technique which allows large numbers of ideas to be classified into groups so we can review and analyze them. You might use it when you have a lot of ideas and you need to group them. A common method to use is writing ideas on post-it notes and putting them on the wall, as you can see in the picture here. When you are looking at the requirements like this, it can help you to classify them so you can identify new requirements you didn't think about before. For the exam, remember that affinity diagrams are used to categorize the ideas. They can be used like the WBS, in which you group the ideas, then you break them down into smaller parts. You can also use affinity diagrams to solve problems. For instance, if you have a major problem, or there's a defect in the product you are working on. Then you will break down the ideas for solving the defect into smaller pieces so you can focus on the most effective solutions. The other data representation technique is mind mapping. You've probably seen this before. Like with the affinity diagram, here we're also breaking down the ideas into smaller parts. Mind maps are graphical tools that we can use to represent the project requirements visually. Let's talk about how we make a mind map. When you create a mind map, you start from the center of the mind map. You specify the main idea, such as the name of the project or the phase you are in. In this mind map, the project is software development. Then you subdivide the main idea into smaller parts, creating branches and sub-branches. Here you can see we have design, analysis, and development, each of which has sub-branches and ideas. You can use pictures, words, or even parts of words to present ideas on the mind map. By the way, there are many software applications you can use to create mind maps. You can even create a mind map manually on a sheet of paper if you choose. We can also use the mind maps to display the results of brainstorming sessions or workshops or focus groups. In Chapter 3, the role of the project manager, we discuss some leadership, interpersonal and team skills you might use. These skills are important for any project manager in order to manage the project successfully. We need them to establish and maintain relationships with other people and to effectively lead and interact with other stakeholders. During the project lifecycle, you, as the project manager, will have to use particular skills based on the process you're in. In the collect requirements process, there are three techniques or skills the project manager can use: nominal group technique, observation or conversation, and facilitation. First, let's look at nominal group technique. Based on the PMBOK, nominal group technique is a technique that enhances brainstorming with a voting process used to rank the most useful ideas for further brainstorming or for prioritization. So, the goal of this technique is to vote on the most useful ideas and to rank them. We usually use this technique in brainstorming meetings. It's a more structured form of brainstorming. To use this technique, you begin by giving the participants the topic you are going to discuss to help you collect requirements. Everyone will think quietly and write down their ideas. Then the moderator writes down all the ideas on a flip chart. Then everyone discusses each of the ideas in detail until all the members of the group understand them well. The last step is everyone will vote privately on each idea using a scale of 1 to 5. You might have many rounds of voting, which allow you to prioritize all the ideas. Another interpersonal and team skill we use is observation and conversation. Observation is also known as job shadowing. Remember this for the exam. Usually, this involves an external observer watching a business expert doing their job. We can also use it to help identify requirements by watching the user of the product at work. We might even participate in the work ourselves. Observation is very useful because it can help us to see situations from a different point of view. When you're watching the people doing the work, you will have a better idea of the problems they face and how these can be solved. Sometimes people don't always know what to say when you ask them for their requirements. When you watch them, you might find hidden requirements that they wouldn't think to tell you about. You will find this technique is very effective when routine activities are difficult to describe. We use observation and conversation in the collect requirements process to understand the user's experiences or if the user isn't keen to give you the requirements. Our third skill here is facilitation. Facilitation is another type of meeting or session. We use facilitation in workshops where we bring key stakeholders together to focus on defining the product requirements and reconciling the differences in their perspectives. Collaborative techniques let us get everyone together to talk about what they think the project has to achieve and how we can do that. During the facilitation session, we use a facilitator who might be the project manager or a person with a specific training. The facilitators help everyone communicate and work together and get everyone to do their best thinking, and they can bring out each person's creative potential, and they know how to deal with difficult people, and they understand how important a good environment is for the meeting. A well-facilitated session can also build a trust, foster or support relationships, and improve communication among the participants, because it gives equal opportunity to all stakeholders, and the end result is we achieve consensus on the requirements. We want a consensus because we want the relevant stakeholders to support the project decisions, even when there isn't 100% agreement. Remember that the key points here are improve the speed and collaboration, and there isn't much paper documentation involved, so it's a faster process, like the stand-up daily meetings. Here are some examples of the facilitation discussions you might use to collect the project requirements. First, JAD, Joint Application, Design or Development. JAD sessions are often used in the software sector. They are facilitated sessions in which we bring together business experts like business analysts, software developers, or designers, consultants to discuss the requirements and improve the software development process. Next, QFD, Quality Function Deployment. This is usually used in the manufacturing sector. It's also known as the Voice of the Customer, VOC. QFD is a structured technique that ensures customer requirements are included in the design of products and the processes. The QFD concept is to take data from the customer and turn it into achievable goals in a product development so we can satisfy their needs and wants. This is why it's called Voice of the Customer. Now that we've listened to the team and we've listened to the customer, we also need to listen to the end user's perspectives, because they also have requirements. For this reason, we have another facilitation technique, which is user stories. A user story is a statement written from the point of view of the user. It describes the functionality that's needed in the solution. Usually, we use user stories in agile development, but we can use them in any methodology approach. To create user stories, you or the product owner facilitate requirements workshops with the end users, where they write down what they want from the project, what their requirements are, using a specific format of writing. By the way, sometimes you or your team or any expert might write user stories on behalf of the users themselves. A user story takes the format of as a type of user or the role of the end user. I want to be able to do the function or the goal he wants, so that I can get the business reason, the benefit, or the motivation. For example, as a trainer, I can update one of my existing courses or events so that it reflects accurate information. Or, as a trainer, I can delete one of my courses or events so it's no longer listed, and so on. Now, let's move to another tool and technique, which is context diagrams. A context diagram is a picture of the scope of your project. It shows a high-level overview of how users will interact with the processes, equipment, and computer systems, and so on. It helps your team understand the relationship between all the processes and features, and to understand the scope and boundaries of a system or process easily. We usually use these diagrams in software projects. Remember that the context diagram is an example of a scope model. When we draw a context diagram, we usually use a circle which shows the main process we are working on. It can be one of the major systems in your project. It will be surrounded by rectangles or squares for systems, processes, or people that interact with it. We call these external entities actors. Actors are roles or positions, not individuals. For example, customer or management, supplier, department, or internal or external users. And we use arrows to show the environments, the activities, and the flow of data to and from the main process and the actors, and also between the actors themselves. And remember that the context diagrams don't show the sequence of steps in a process. Let's look at this example here. We are looking at the interaction between the cafeteria or the system, which we are developing, and internal and external entities. The cafeteria or the system is in the circle in the middle of the diagram. Then we've identified all the actors that interact with our system. We draw arrows showing the direction of the data flows from each actor to the process or to other actors. So, the new order system will let the customers log into the application, view the menu, place an order, and pay. They can bring their receipt down to the cafeteria and collect their food in a pickup area. By creating a context diagram like this, we can think more about the new requirements we weren't able to see before. And this is why it's one of the tools and techniques for collecting requirements. The last tool and technique we have is prototypes. A prototype is a model of the end product or process. We create it before we build the actual product. One of the prototyping techniques we can use is storyboarding. It tells a story using a series of images or illustrations, as you can see here. In software development, we use storyboards to show how users will navigate through pages, screens, or other user interfaces. Storyboards and prototypes are very useful because they let the customer see what the end product will be like, which helps us to discover new requirements early. Plus, customers enjoy seeing what the end result will be like. Prototypes support a progressive elaboration because you will often update the prototype many times to incorporate feedback you receive until the final requirements are agreed on. To create your prototypes or storyboards, you can use a computer program like AutoCAD or Visio, or you can create a prototype manually. Here you can see some examples of prototypes, like 3D models, for instance, architectural rendering of a building, 2D models like floor plans, or small-scale products when we might create sketches of a new product, and mockups of interfaces or reports. We might create simulations for manufacturing products. Now, let's look at the outputs for collect requirements. We have two outputs, requirements documentation and requirements traceability matrix. They allow you to document and track the requirements throughout the project lifecycle. We'll explore requirements documentation first. Of course, we can all agree that documenting requirements is logical and necessary and important. There are a few things we should keep in mind about requirements documentation. After analyzing all the information we've collected, we will create the requirements documentation, which can take many forms like specifications, written text, models, and so on. We can choose which form to use based on the development approach, organizational practices, and stakeholder preferences. For example, if we are using adaptive methodologies like Agile or Lean in our project, it's better to use lightweight or less extensive requirements specifications because the development environment is more collaborative and we use conversations more than documentation. While in waterfall or predictive approaches, we might be more detailed. But since the output is called requirements documentation, we do need to document. The PMBOK defines the requirements documentation as a description of how individual requirements meet the business need for the project. As you know, each project has goals, objectives, and business needs. All of these are documented in the business case document before we started the project. In the requirements documentation, we document the requirements which meet the main business need. Requirements documentation can include technical requirements that the seller is required to satisfy. For instance, if you want to create a data center, you need cables, technicians, etc. These are technical requirements. We might also need to document requirements with contractual and legal implications, which can be things like health, safety requirements, security, performance requirements, environmental requirements, and so on. When written and high quality requirements need to have certain attributes. The requirements need to be unambiguous, which means that the requirement has only one meaning and is understood the same way by the stakeholders. For instance, one of the requirements is personal electronics. That's ambiguous. It doesn't tell us whether we need laptops, phones, tablets, cameras. The requirements need to be measurable and testable, so they should be written in a way that allows them to be tested, so we can verify them through analysis, test, inspection, or demonstration. Requirements should be traceable. They also need to be complete, so they include the information we need to design, build, and test the solution. And consistent, meaning any requirement doesn't contradict or duplicate any other requirement. So we have to make sure to include only one requirement per requirement. And finally, they must be acceptable to key stakeholders. As you can see here, we have 6 types or classifications of requirements. Make sure you understand them well because you are likely to get questions about them in the exam. Also, there are a foundation for the next output, which is requirements traceability matrix, where you will need to tag your project requirements. We will start with business requirements. The business requirements include the business need, the required capabilities, the solution scope, and the business case. These are the high-level needs of the organization. They provide the reason why a project is initiated. The business requirements created for a project are like the frame on a painting. They frame and control the scope of the desired solution. A business requirement is something that the business needs to do or have in order to stay in business. For instance, if we don't find the best way to reach our customer, we could be out of business. So the business requirement would be something like we need to contact the customer with certain information. Another business requirement is the productivity will grow by 5% next year. As you can tell, these are high level and they will be the basis for the other requirements. Then we have stakeholder requirements. These are the needs of a specific stakeholder or a group of stakeholders like customers, users, or suppliers. We usually make sure that stakeholders with very different perspectives provide requirements. For example, in a software project, we need a notification to be sent to executives when a customer opens a problem ticket, or we need a screen to view historical problem tickets for a customer. These examples are requirements which are describing what the stakeholder needs the new system to have. It's important to understand here that these requirements don't state how the stakeholders want these requirements to be implemented. They simply state what is required. These requirements provide the basis for identifying the next type of requirements, solution requirements. The solution requirements describe how the stakeholder requirements should be implemented. These describe features, functions, and characteristics of the project or product that will meet the business and stakeholder requirements. Solution requirements are grouped into functional and non-functional requirements. Functional requirements tell us about the behaviors of the product or service. They describe how the system will look, like colors, size of the screens, web or desktop, and how the system will perform or behave. These requirements can include features and functions that the product should have. For instance, the system will generate a daily report. The system will make regular backups, and so on. As for non-functional requirements, they are environmental conditions or qualities required to ensure the product or service operates effectively. These are things that go beyond functions. These are requirements related to customer experience, risk management, security, operations, maintenance, usability, and so on. Non-functional requirements often refer to external documents such as standards, policies, and procedures. For instance, pages will be designed according to usability standards. The system response time should be maximum 2 seconds. training materials will be developed for the product, and so on. The fourth type is transition and readiness requirements. These requirements are temporary things which are needed during the project. As we discussed before, the project drives change, the point of which is to move from where we are now, which is the current as-is state, to where we want to be, which is the desired future state. These requirements won't be needed once the transition is complete. They are different from other requirements types because they are always temporary and because they can't be developed until both an existing and a new solution are defined. For example, there are things like data conversion from existing systems, training requirements, and other related changes which are needed to reach the desired future state. The next type is project requirements, which describe the actions, processes, or other conditions the project needs to meet. These requirements focus on the execution of the work required to deliver the project, such as milestone dates, contractual obligations, constraints, etc. For instance, we have to deliver a prototype to the customer by June. We have to keep to the budget which is mentioned in the contract. Finally, quality requirements. These are any condition or criteria needed to validate the successful completion of a project deliverable or other project requirements. They demonstrate compliance with identified standards and quality metrics. For instance, requirements for tests, certifications, validations, etc. Does the team need to use a specific tool to test the product? Is there a specific environment for testing? What are the criteria the product needs to achieve during the tests? And so on. Now, let's look at the requirements traceability matrix. This slide shows you an example of one. Organizations often trace their requirements using a structure or a spreadsheet, which is called a traceability matrix. The purpose of this is to create a table or grid that shows the relationships between business objectives, requirements, other deliverables, and solution components to support project management or other activities. We need to know the relationships between the requirements and the other artifacts in the project, so we have to trace them, and the requirement traceability matrix can help us to do that. It lets us link the requirements from the beginning to the deliverables throughout the project lifecycle. Typically, the requirement traceability matrix can include the requirement ID, which is uniquely identifies each requirement, a short description of the requirement, the business needs, opportunities, goals, and objectives, the project objectives, the project scope, and WBS deliverables, which are linked to the requirement. It contains information about product development stages, like design, analysis, implementation. It includes the test strategy or test scenarios or test cases we need for each requirement. What's the validation strategy for testing? How we'll verify and get acceptance? The requirements in this matrix can be high level or more detailed, so we might include the status of the requirements, such as active, approved, deferred, completed, why the requirement is important, the owner who is responsible for working on the requirement, the source where the requirement came from, who identified the requirement, or any other details you want to add. So, this is the last thing in this process, collect requirements. Next, we will look at the defined scope process.